from Michelle Denogean, who's the Chief Marketing Officer of a company that you've all heard of called Roadster. They're leading the way when it comes to digital retailing. Today, she's going to talk about digitizing your sales process. So, Michelle, welcome. And if you're ready, go ahead and share your screen and we'll get you going.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks, Dave. Okay. So like David said, what we are here to talk about today is digitizing your sales process. And I think the big thing to keep in mind here is that, everybody went through something pretty significant this year, right? And so I don't need to talk too much about what that was all about as it relates to COVID. But what we're going to dive deep into is what we learned. Because one of the things that we've been following, and this came from talking to a lot of dealer partners early and often through, the springtime when everything, hit really hard on the industry, leading up to even now, as to what that experience was like, and more importantly, what did we learn? And so we're going to share some data as it relates to what we've learned during this time frame, and then talk a little bit more about this idea of digitizing your sales process, or a lot of people refer to it as remote selling, right? So let me just get into it and we'll go from there. So like I said, I'm not going to dive deep into any of these headlines because I feel like everybody has lived it as it relates to what was happening around the coronavirus pandemic. And, I think what's interesting sitting in my shoes or my lens of this has been that we've talked for a long time about how do you modernize your customer experience. And we had a lot of dealers who were already leaned into that, had some kind of digital retailing in place before the pandemic. And then of course, when things hit, a lot of the stores and probably a lot of your stores had to shut down, could only be open for online sales. And so we had different ways that we were actually operating during this time. But when we were forced to do that, a lot of learning came out of that, which I think is really strong for us as we carry forward in a post-COVID world, if I can even say that right now, because Dave would probably agree. We don't know when this thing is actually ending. But
fingers are crossed, that's for
right?
sure.
Yeah. But regardless, whether it's right now or, when things are fully recovered, I know that showrooms are back opened. And, a lot of good has come from this, as hard as it's been for the industry in what we've learned and how we've changed our process. So what I'm going to talk about, like I said, is a study that we did. And the first thing I want to address is why we did it. We started studying the pandemic very early. Our first wave of study happened in May, and it was partly because we started seeing data like this. And this is Roadster data that shows this significant growth in the percentage of total sales that were all of a sudden happening online. And so we saw this in our data, and you can see here in April, we started to see this just significant spike where we went from less than 14% of transactions to over 30 at the height happening online. And so we saw this growth. Of course, like I said, it was a bit of a forcing function. So a lot of people were onboarding with digital retailing at the time. And then you also had stores that's all they could do, right? So I'm not saying that this was all consumer driven. I think this was very much driven by the situation as well. But we started to see this trend, almost overnight. At the same time, we were talking very closely with NADA because, this is a trend that they have seen for a really long time. And I actually didn't know that they've been studying this since 1985. But since 1985, and probably before then, and Dave, you might have comments on this, the number of units that our salespeople have been able to sell has not fundamentally changed. It's been stuck at 10 or a little less, like the average across the board. And so their data was like, look, it's been 35 years. No matter what we've done, we have not been able to fundamentally move this needle, whether it's pay plans or, tools that we've provided the teams. We've always had those onesie twosies that are really great, salespeople, but the average overall has not moved. And so this was data that they gave us, but when we actually moved into looking at what was happening during the pandemic, we started to see it rise for the very, very first time, where all of a sudden in June, as we sort of came out of that, initial month of real lockdown, we started to see it grow to 12 units in June and in July. And so this sort of led to us saying, this is a really interesting time. There's a lot going on in the industry, and we should study the fact that more people are moving online and the fact that the agents are able to sell more units than they ever were able to before. So what was really causing it?
This is really interesting data, and what we're finding is dealerships that had to close down during the pandemic, or dealerships that curbed their headcount, what they found was the pressure from the consumers to sell the vehicle was really high, but they had fewer salespeople. So there's a lot of variables that might have forced this growth. And I would be curious if you had a geographical study as you go forward, how you can slice it to find out if states that didn't experience the locked showrooms and the closed dealerships versus those that were wide open, perhaps like a Florida or an Oklahoma or in North Dakota, states like that, because this is really powerful data, and it goes to show that if you can reduce the headcount cost and increase the units per salesperson, that will drive profitability as well.
Exactly. And we do have that data. We don't have it sliced that way, but I'll tell you a sneak peek is that we redid this study in September when everybody was opened, and the numbers actually grew even further. Wow. So it's not as regional as maybe it was in the beginning, but not as regional here in the end. So like I said, we did 2 waves of this study. The first was in May, where we surveyed 236 dealers, and we did this in partnership with NADA. So we had some of the dealers were Roadster customers. The majority of them were actually NADA members. And then we did a second wave that we just finished, where we studied 320 dealers, same split, some Roadster, mostly NADA members. And then we added on 1,000 consumers to this as well, because we really wanted to understand at this point, when you look at September backwards, we had 5 months of consumer experience buying cars. So if they bought between April and August, we wanted to hear about their experience. And so just to give you a quick fast forward into what we found on the efficiency side, was that the units per person, according to our study, in May hit a high of 13 units. So the NADA data around the same time said 12. That was across a wider group. Our study sample said that it was 13 units for those that took the study. When we came back around and we did this in September, and this is what you were talking about, Dave, right? When everybody was open, we said, well, let's hope we held. Like, that was my thought going into this. Let's hope that we kept this increase in units. It actually grew even more. So in our wave in September, we were seeing 16 units per salesperson. And you're right in what you were saying before. A lot of this is driven by the headcount reductions. And we'll talk about that a little bit, because I think that was in itself a little bit of a forcing function. I don't think that's the only reason by any means that this happened. But when you had a smaller staff, you no longer had to rely on a lot of those formulas that we've created over the 35 years or so that say, hey, if you're modeling out staffing, you should have 10 units per person and spit out the number of salespeople you have on the other side. I think this is telling us that you should look at that assumption and model it slightly differently, because I think the expectation can be higher.
Yes.
So this is what you were talking about before, about the showrooms open. When we came back and we did this study, this sort of wave 2 in September, about 92% was where the staffing levels were on average across the stores. And you can see here on the left, the different percentages breaking out. Obviously, by September, most of the dealerships had brought back a lot of the staff that they had reduced in the April-May timeframe. So you had the majority at 30 quarters or more staffed. But we still overall were a little bit lighter. I think some of that is protecting for the future and the unknown, and some of that is also some learnings. On average, we saw about 2.5 salespeople was the reduction specifically in that department. And so I think what we're seeing is, okay, can we do more? Is it possible? And how do we right size that with demand? So you have to ask yourself, okay, like I said, is it staffing? Is it demand? Is it efficiency? And I think that the big thing that we wanted to add in this particular study was, what was the consumer experience? Did they save time in this process? Because I think that was one of the big things that was on everybody's mind. Just knowing that we were ensuring they were doing more online. It was sort of, we had to, right? And so we split this up by dealers that were only open online, dealers that were open by appointment, and then dealers that were fully open. And this was reported by the consumer. So the question was, when you bought your car, what was the situation at the dealership you purchased it from? And the interesting thing is, regardless of the restriction, about 44% of consumers said they did some part of the actual transaction online. This is not the shopping, aspect. This is actually starting the purchase process. And you can see that varied greatly between the people that were only open online and then when the showrooms were opened fully. And I have a different lens on this data than maybe others do. And it's partly because I think of where we sit and the dealers we talk to. But I will say that the dealers that were only open online because they had to do it that way were being a lot more proactive with the consumers than any other category was. And so that proactive nature of not just waiting for the consumer to come to your website and do the transaction on their own, but actually encouraging them, guiding them through that process is really what we were starting to see. That's why 50% of the people that were open online saw the majority of that, purchase process happening in some kind of digital form.
Well, as I look at this data, Michelle, and I see that 29% claimed 100% purchased online, there might be some naysayers that will sit here and say, well, still had to sign a document, I had to do a wet signature, so it's not 100%. My perspective is pretty clear cut. If the guest feels as though they purchased online, they purchased online. And I 100% am thrilled by this data.
Yeah, I that's what I was going to say as you were starting to talk. It's all perception, but perception is reality. I think people say the same thing about Carvana, right? Well, they don't really purchase online, but you know what? Everybody that purchases from them thinks they did. So it is definitely a perception, situation. We dug one layer deeper into this data and we looked at what parts of the transaction they actually did. And what was interesting, this was not planned. I wish I could say it was planned, but after we did the study, I went back and I saw that Cox actually did a study in 2019, so just a year before. And they actually had very similar data set of what percentage did they do of price negotiation, of credit apps, of financing. And overall, what their study said was, in actuality, what consumers were doing was they were doing these things online less than 10% of the time. And when we actually layered in what was actually happening in this sort of COVID world, what you'll see is things like, even, with dealerships back opened and not only online sales, 34% of the time, the price negotiation was happening in a digital form. The credit application was happening in a digital form, the financing, leasing, and even the F&I selection, which I think is really interesting to see that being so high here. Just significant growth in this move of parts of the transaction actually happening in an online situation.
That's remarkable. So what's the differential between all and online sales only? I know you've covered it previously, but for this slide, could you explain that just a little bit?
So that's every single consumer that we surveyed, whether the dealership was only open for online sales or open by appointment or fully open. That's across the board. And the online sales only is just the consumers that said that when they purchased, that dealership was only open to do it online. Gotcha. And so again, like I said, it was a forcing function because the consumer and the dealer had to do it this way. But I think what that really says is the dealership was encouraging that behavior. That's why you're seeing, significant pop for that group.
Wow.
So the next question we asked the consumer was around the speed of the transaction. Because I think, everybody has seen studies that talk about, after 90 minutes, satisfaction significantly goes down, right? There's this linkage between the time it takes to buy the car and the satisfaction with that experience. And so we looked at the subset of consumers that actually said that they bought previously. And 63% of those consumers said that this purchase was more efficient than their previous purchase. So they said that it was just a lot faster and easier for them to go through it. And just to put a little bit more data towards that, we looked at, and we actually asked the question of how much time did it take? And what you'll see here is that 38%, more than a third of the people that we surveyed said that they were able to do the transaction in under an hour. Oh. And it's a big shift because we've been tracking this at Roadster. So, full transparency, that last one is our survey. February and April is data that Roadster captures with every transaction where we ask, the customer after they finish with the dealer, would you recommend this dealership to a friend or family member? And then we ask them how long the transaction took and how satisfied they were with that. So we've been asking that since November of last year. But in February, right before COVID hit, only 9% of people said that it happened in less than an hour. And now we've shot up to, more than 38% saying that, yep, I did this within an hour.
Wow.
So, what does that leave us with sort of in the end? And I think the thing to really think about is, what does digital retailing mean? What role does it play? Yes, we had less people, but why were those people that were left behind able to be more efficient? And I will tell you that the dealers that we surveyed are saying that it is because they had digital retailing in place. That was what made them more efficient. So this is both the May survey and the September survey. Of course, there's things that we would just expect from digital retailing, like it enabled me to engage more with my online customers. I think that's a given. But the things that really stood out to me was what it did internally for the dealership. It allowed my team to complete transactions in a contactless way, 63% in May. It made my sales process more efficient. It saved me time, not just my customer, but me, 70% of the time. And it allowed my team to sell more cars per person. Almost half of the people we surveyed said that that was the case. And so I think we're looking at a very unique situation where it's really a win-win, right? Not only does digital retailing help with engagement, but it's helping to make our sales teams a lot more productive. And so that's sort of the net of everything. And it shows up too in things like the roles that people are playing. So in May, we asked the question around what would you likely modify for the future? And this was pretty early in the process. So this was more of them hypothesizing. And they said, you know what, the BDC internet team, the showroom sales, I see some kind of modification coming out of this. In September, we asked about actual staffing levels. And you'll see that the BDC and the internet team is really where the growth was happening versus like the showroom teams, where I think that was where if they had to take a hit, that was where they were pulling it from. Every dealership I personally talked to is different. Some people said, no, we added to the showroom team. And I think it's more the skill sets that they're looking for now versus before. So we're seeing a huge growth and a focus on customer service, having technology savviness to some degree so they can use these tools, and being process oriented. I think those are the really key skill sets that are coming to the surface. And I don't think it's a surprise that, when you're faced with who do I bring back if I, had to, do I bring back the person that is sort of a lone island, doesn't really follow the process, doesn't maybe really give that good customer experience, but maybe sells a lot of cars, or the person that is very good at remote selling, very process oriented, and can sell more per person because they're following a process that works. I think in the end, most dealerships picked the latter. And I've got examples of dealerships that have told me that when forced, push came to shove, they wanted that person that could really hone in on that remote selling capability. So in the end, I think the remote selling aspect is here to stay. That's really the takeaway. And we've been asking that, all along as to what is the big thing that you think you're going to take away from this. And that whole capability of being able to guide somebody through the process is what they've said. And there's a lot of different strategies that you can put into action today in order to embrace remote selling. So there's things like, you know what, instead of just waiting for the customer to come to your website and engage in digital retailing, be proactive with it. Share the interactive deal sheets with those internet customers, those phone ups, based on the vehicle of interest. Make it personal to what they were actually looking at, but give them the opportunity to actually engage. Because what we do know is that 30% of the deal making activity is happening when your store is closed. So if you give them that first in opportunity to self-service and then guide them through that process, that's something that everybody could do today. Replacing, your generic CRM autoresponders. I'm sure Dave could probably talk about this one for days, with quality responses that actually answer their questions. And like I said, guiding the customer through the process. I think that's super key. It's that proactive nature of, you don't have to rush to the appointment. If they can do some of these things up front, then you really are going to save both the customer and your team time. That's what's actually causing them to be able to sell to multiple customers at the same time. Introducing F&I products early and often, whether that's online, via phone or video chat. I think people have gotten really creative with different ways that they can have that presentation. And then, like I said, working multiple deals at once. This is the thing that people are doing that are able to gain that 16, 17, 20, 30 units per person. It's not a linear process anymore. When somebody's at home, you can work with different customers at different stages. So I'm happy to talk more about that during the Q&A. So there's a lot of takeaways from this data. I'll leave you with two. The units per salesperson continues to grow. So I think we just need to reassess our expectations and sort of our assumptions in some of our models. And, hopefully as we recover, what that means for us is we can actually sell more cars than we ever have with the people that we have, because that expectation has grown. And then the transaction time, the fact that the consumer experience is saying that it's more efficient is huge. So this is the two big takeaways. And I'll just spend one more minute walking you through a couple different scenarios of what this could mean. So as an example, what this could mean for sales consultants, if they can sell more units per person, then maybe we pay them more because they're able to do that. And can that allow us to attract a different type of person for the job? That's something to consider. For the sales manager, what does it mean if they have less people to manage? Do they have more time to coach? Is there an opportunity to spend more time with the customers? And then finally, for the dealership, looking at costs, a compensation per unit sold, could definitely, be reduced, and there could be some cost savings there. So there's just a lot of implications for people to take into consideration when it comes to digitizing your sales process in this whole world of remote selling. So that's really diving deep. I'll just leave you with this final slide, which is there's three things to consider when it comes to digital retailing: engagement, efficiency, which is what we spent most of the time talking about, and customer satisfaction. I think a lot of people are always looking at what's the ROI of digital retailing? How do I measure this? And this is the way that we measure it with our partners, is to look at, can it increase engagement? Can I sell more per person? And in the end, am I building loyalty and repeat business and referrals? So that's it.
Bravo. Excellent job, Michelle. I could hug and take all the time for Q&A, and thank you for letting me interject there, but it's irresistible for me because this is a world that I love. This is a world that I've been part of for the last 20 years, so to speak, and it inspires me to see the evidence. And we're all the time wanting to see the data to support the emotion, and this really works in that direction. So let's go to Q&A. And Michelle, once again, that was a great presentation. It took me the second time seeing it to understand when you showed the slide of the salespeople, maybe we pay them more. I remember saying to my dad as a young salesperson, I need a raise. And he goes, oh, son, I'm not holding you back. Go sell more cars.
That's right.
when you show that 60% boost in productivity, that had to be pretty amazing. And dealers are just by nature skeptical, but they're also optimistic. Tell us a little bit about how that conversation has gone with those guys. You saw that quote that you put on there from Asbury. Did they come to you with this? Did you point it out to them? What was this epiphany moment?
Yeah, well, I think it actually started, and I said this in the video, it started with some of our dealer partners coming to us. And as we, you know, when COVID first hit, one of the very first things that I personally did, and a lot of folks at Roadster did, was we just started calling and checking in with our dealer partner. Are you okay? What's happening in your area, right? Like, I think everybody would admit that that's really what happened when everything first shut down, and right, everybody was checking on each other. And through those conversations, we started to hear this interesting thing of, like, you know, obviously we had to, you know, furlough or lay off some people. That was unfortunate. But the people that are here are able to, you know, we're seeing them sell 30, 40, 50 cars. I mean, at the time that the numbers were astronomical, not just the 16, but it was like, hey, you know, this salesperson, we may only have 5 of them, but this guy, he sold and delivered 50 cars all by himself, literally, like, drove the car to the customer's house and to the delivery. And so when you start hearing those stories of these people that are using the technology and what they're doing exactly in order to facilitate that actually was part of what led to the study, because we were like, this is incredible. How far reaching is this? So it was a bit of them coming to us and then us sort of reaching out to the industry.
So being the realist, I think there are going to be a lot of dealers that are kind of wiping their cloth on digital retailing and saying, okay, that's good, but now can't wait till we can have guests back in the showroom. What are you hearing from the progressive retailers? Are they saying no way, no how? What's the situation there?
Yeah, I'll address both of those because I think those are different spectrums. The progressive dealers, it was interesting. So when the shutdown first happened, obviously we've had dealers on with Roadster for years, right? So we've had a lot of those progressive sort of early adopters on the platform. And the first thing that they said to us was like, we weren't going back before and we're not going back now. Like, it hasn't fundamentally changed a whole lot. And so I think those that were already at that stage were already all in and just knew how to operate. It was less of a transition per se. But we've got dealerships even that were doing very well before now coming to the table and saying, like, we're actually sending customers, and they come in the showroom, we're sending them home or to Starbucks. Like, we want them to go, you know, somewhere they're comfortable and complete the transaction. We know they're going to buy, so they don't necessarily have to be here. And if they're not here, I can help this other customer while they're doing parts. So I think that's the progressive, right? Others that are like, we're just 100% online. We're a technology company. But I think that's, you know, a bit more of the minority than the majority. What I do see is showrooms open for most dealers is that obviously, you know, everybody I think is a little stir crazy, and that, you know, human connection is real and people want them in the store. But they're trying to blend and figure out, you know, how do we still maintain some of this remote capability? And I think they've learned that they can create connection that way and also have them come into the store. So that seamless connection between what that customer did online to what they actually do in the showroom is so critical as we open back up and, you know, have people walking into our showrooms.
Good. So we've got one more question that I want to throw out there because we're running short on time, and I know this is something you and I have talked about a lot. I'm not going to reveal their name, the person who asked it, but it's a tactical question, and the way he posed it was, I don't feel comfortable sending a link, and she talked about sending a link to where the guests can do it and 24/7. I've got my opinion on that as well. We've seen the data, not even just the data, but we've seen it in the CRM, the engagement level change. And I won't say which way. I'll let you let the genie out on that. But let's talk about that sharing of it when we're used to in a lot of dealerships to where, you know, if the guest is coming in for the appointment, the salesperson used to go pull the sell tag off the mirror dangler, so that they didn't have to sell it for the price it was promoted for. So in this environment, how do you convince people to share the interaction data?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. A couple of things came up there, right? Transparency is one. Engagement is another. I think, it's challenging if transparency is a concern, because we live in such a state right now where it actually is all out there, right? I mean, all you have to do is go to some of the third-party sites, and we're all posting pricing. So it's not to say that everybody has to go one price and, stick with that 100%, but you have to have a competitive price out there for them to engage and start interacting with the deal structure that they can make when they go online. And I think the thing to consider, and we see this in our data, is there's actually a little bit less going back and forth because they have control over the levers. So they know what their payment could be. They see your price. They can start to look at different aspects and really dwindle it down to something that makes sense to them. So that's what I say about the transparency. The engagement of sending links, I think that we've all sort of relied on autoresponders and other things for a long time, but we don't always answer the question that the customer has. And the one thing that digital retailing does do is it sends them to a place where they can get their questions answered. And I think that's the most important thing to focus on. And we see it in the data. We know already that 30% of the deal-making activity is happening after hours. We know that if we send them, exact information about the vehicle they're interested, they're going to continue the conversation with you. So, I don't know where you sit on it, Dave. I'd love to hear, and maybe later we can spar if it's different. But I think that the engagement is only stronger, but you do have to believe in some level of transparency in order to do it.
Yeah, and I think mine is driven by the data once again. I remember when I was working at Ford Direct, I used to say to the guys, I'm a dealer. I've been raised in a dealership my whole life. I got to go with my gut. And they'd say, wouldn't it be great if you combined your gut, which we really appreciate. They were placating me, of course. But what if we mixed it with data? Wouldn't that even be better? And I was like, okay, I finally relented. And so here's what our data shows is, if a dealer is willing to share the link of their digital retailing platform to the consumer through whatever means, whether it's co-navigating on the screen at the same time or sending an email or text with the link, letting that guest play around with it in the comfort of their coffee shop or home or work really drives engagement level. The higher the engagement, the higher the chance of an appointment, the higher the chance of a show, which is the higher the chance for a sell, and that's why you have productivity go up. That's what our data shows, and I believe it with all my heart. So Michelle, exceptional presentation and great data set. I look forward to many more conversations about this as it goes forward.